whereas before it was always like blind panic. Now that we've been used to it. So welcome everybody who's joining us on YouTube. As today we're with our Wednesday study class, in which needs no name because we don't have a name. And welcome to everybody. We've got people from South Carolina, but at least one person from Texas and one person in North Carolina visiting family. So we've got people in 3 states right now, and I hope you guys are doing well. So we decided last week that we're going to talk about Passover next week and the week after, and that today we wanted to study a little bit more about Maimonides and the 13 attributes of God and the Mission of Torah and the Guide to Perplexed. So that was a lot to do in one day. So I thought we'd just do basically the Guide to the Perplexed and Mission of Torah today, because those are his most famous works. So has everybody heard of Maimonides? Probably heard of him. He's also known as the Rambam, or in Georgia, the Rambam, however you want to do it. But and I like your hair, Rena. So the Rambam is one of the greatest Jewish thinkers in history. He lived in the 1100s in the 12th century in Egypt, which was a very good place to be a Jew during this period. He was basically a student being supported by his brother. His brother died, so he had to get a job. So what kind of job did he get? Like any good Jewish kid, he became a doctor, but a very, very prominent doctor, probably the most prominent doctor of his age. He attended to people in Europe and, of course, in Egypt. But not only was he a doctor, he's much more famous for being a halachist, a person who wrote about Jewish law based upon the Talmud and other things. But not only a doctor, a halachist, but also a philosopher, writing the greatest treatise on Jewish philosophy still to this age, called the Guide to the Perplexed. So those are the two. He wrote a lot of other things. We talked about the attributes, but the 2 greatest of his works are first the Mission of Torah and the Guide to the Perplexed. And we're going to talk about those 2 great works because it's essential. They work in some ways in tandem with each other. One's philosophy, one is law. So you would think, generally speaking, most people are good at one of those 2. It's rare that you see someone who's very good at both, and even rare when you find somebody who is the best at both. So he was probably the best of his age at 3 different things: medicine, Jewish law, and philosophy. And so a very impressive guy. Now, we've all heard about Maimonides. He's very famous, and we know that his Mishnah Torah is prominent. His Guide to the Perplexed is prominent. That is looking back at him. During his time, he was not considered as prominent as he would become later. In fact, he even wrote many times that people right now will not appreciate me, but in the future, I will be appreciated by all, and my works will be kind of a little full of himself, but not really, because he's right. You're only full of yourself if you're not right. Michael Jordan saying, "I'm the best basketball player, I'm going to win a championship," is not being full of himself. It's being confident. Me saying I'm the best basketball player of all time is being just a fool. So what we see here is during his age, he was loved, but he was also loathed. Some considered him brilliant. Others considered him a heretic. He was probably the most famous heretic of that whole age in some circles. So we have to understand now he's generally venerated, but at the time he was venerated in some circles, but not in all. Now, why was he venerated and why was he loathed? Now, being venerated is obvious. He was brilliant. He did all these amazing things. It's not hard to. Why wasn't he venerated? One, he was Sephardic. And so if you're Sephardic, who's not necessarily going to always follow what you do, and that is going to be Ashkenazim. So that's one group. 2.
Excuse me, Rabbi, what is that?
That's people Ashkenazic, people from Eastern Europe.
Oh, okay.
He's descended, his family was from Spain. They left during a very precarious time period for Jews when the Mamelukes had taken over, and then they ended up moving to Egypt. So he was Sephardic. So obviously, if you're Sephardic, you generally follow Sephardic rabbis, Sephardic sages. Number two, in his Mishnah Torah, where he takes the whole Talmud, he basically takes the Talmud, 35 volumes, and he just puts it into 14 categories of laws to make it easier. And he says, basically, all you need to do is read what I wrote. You don't need to read the Talmud, or at least some people took him as saying that, which he really didn't. So some people thought he said, you don't have to read the Talmud anymore. You just have to read what he wrote. It's kind of like saying, I've written my law. Robert's written his laws based upon the Bible. You guys don't need to write the Bible anymore. Just read my laws. So he didn't actually say that. He did say you should still study the Talmud, but he did say you need my book. And lastly, he was considered a heretic because of his work on philosophy. His work on philosophy takes Jewish philosophy to an entirely different level, a place it had never gone before. Well, I mean, some people like Philo had gone in that direction, but nobody as famous and as brilliant as him. So it took Jewish philosophy in a direction a lot of Jews, maybe even most Jews, were not prepared to go to in that age. And so if he had written the Guide to the Perplexed before the Mishnah Torah, he would have probably been considered a heretic by all. But he wrote the Mishnah Torah first, his great work on Jewish law, before his great work on Jewish philosophy. So it's kind of like if you've proven yourself, you can do something crazy. But if you haven't proven yourself and you do something crazy, you're just considered crazy. So we're going to talk a little bit about both of these works and understand that this man was coming at a perfect time in many respects for Jews. So let's go back in time and see why he had the opportunity to be so special. And we've talked about this in history. Today, the Western world, Europe, America, Australia, Israel, Japan, has been at the top of the intellectual mountain for a long time. Certainly China's caught up, but we have been the intellectual elite. The Middle East, North Africa, has not been the intellectual elite. They've kind of been at the lower levels in the last 50 years or 100 years, certainly the last couple hundred years. In the year 1100, it was the opposite. Obviously, America was only indigenous people were living here, so that wasn't part of the group. But Europe was in the midst of the Dark Ages. They had given up Greek philosophy, Greek thought. You're not allowed to read. You're not allowed to bathe. Superstitions everywhere. It was the Dark Ages. That's why it's called the Dark Ages. Whereas in the Muslim world, it was the most educated world up to that moment in time. They had taken all of the Greek thought, philosophy, mathematics, and translated them. They were the best at science, the best at literature, the best at travel, basically the best at industry. They're basically the best of almost everything. China was maybe just a little, it was still pretty good, but still behind them. So he is living in this very intellectually appreciative world. And that's why he can be what he is. The Jews in Europe, especially in Eastern Europe, are not living in as open a society. Now, some areas of France were getting better places, but it'll be another 50 to 100 years before it really starts to get impact. So there are places in Europe that are getting to be more educationally oriented, but not like the Muslim world. And so this allows him to be both in the Jewish world and in the outside world. So he's living in both places at the same time. So that gives him added access to information, to thought that people in the Ashkenazic Jewish world didn't have access to. If you ever read the book, How the Irish Saved Civilization, That's a great book talking about this lack of Greek knowledge in the European world, and that the Irish, certain groups of Irish, were the ones who kept all of the Greek thought locked up and protected. But so he's living in this educated world, and he comes and he writes the Mishnah Torah. Now, why is the Mishnah Torah so important? And why is it such an incredible thing? Well, the Talmud is a very long series of books. It's 35 volumes. I'm just giving a number. It can be more or less depending on how I write. It's all very deep discussion about everything. So if Michael wants to find the answer to a question in the Talmud, he's not going to be able to find it. Even if you're a scholar, you may not be able to find it because, one, not everybody has access to all of it. And two, it's all about discussion. It's the answer is not the height of the book. The answer is not the climax. The question's the climax. The discussion's the climax. The answer's the anticlimax. So it's incredibly involved to try and find a simple answer. And so there are three people who attempt to write code books about the Talmud, just taking the law out. So if you just have an answer for a question, can I eat quinoa on Passover? I don't want to try and look through 25 different pages of discussion on what quinoa is. I just want the answer. And if you don't know how to read Aramaic, or if you haven't studied that particular passage over and over again, you're not going to get the answer. He took the answer and said, yes, quinoa is okay, usually from the majority opinion. So he took these answers and put it into a code book that people could read if they're just looking for the answers and not for the discussion. And that was something that had been missing in all of Jewish history until these three men attempted them. And so this is what he does. He helps to bring Talmudic law to the masses, making it easier for the regular folk like us to do it. So any questions on that so far?
Rabbi, who were the other two men?
The other one was Jacob ben Asher, who wrote something called the Arba Turim. And of course, the most famous and one that is used to this day is the Shulchan Aruch, which is by Joseph Caro. That's the main one. And there's a particular reason why. We'll talk about that. Well, we can talk about it now. So this is the first attempt. Okay, so this is the first attempt to bring you have to be incredibly knowledgeable to try and bring suck every law out of the Talmud in an organized fashion. So why is the Mishnah Torah not considered the preeminent one of the three? And it's a very easy answer for the main reason is he does not cite the sources. So when you're reading the Mishnah Torah and he says, yes, you can eat quinoa, he doesn't say, go to this section of the Talmud, go to this place. And so if I'm reading it, how am I going to know this is the proven fact? I can't go double check it. And so that was one of the main reasons, plus that he was Sephardic, plus that he was kind of strange to some people. That's why it didn't become the main code book. Although it is referenced, it is one of the most important books in Judaism, it's not the main code book. Because the Shulchan Aruch, which is the third book to do this, does cite the sources. That book is written by a Sephardic rabbi, but he gets an Ashkenazic rabbi to make addendums to it. So it's got both Sephardic and Ashkenazic. So his book, though, is essential to this day. I mean, it's one of the most cited of all books, and it's the first of the code books to be written. So again, don't take this to say it's not an essential book. It's one of the most essential books in all of Judaism. In fact, not only does he use the Talmud, yes, Larry.
I remember we were in Safad, and we went to the Joseph Caro synagogue there. And I got the impression, I don't know whether you can hear me because it says.
Oh, no, I can. I turned it up. I had it down low, not you. It was me.
We went to the synagogue there, and I got the impression that he was more of a mystic, and that his code, and I took code to mean a different thing at the time, like he was decoding the Bible. You know, sometimes you hear these people, they read things in based on numerology and things like that. But you're saying, no, he basically was giving the simplification. It wasn't
for that. Now, just because he and Maimonides wrote these code books doesn't mean they weren't gifted in mysticism. They both were. In fact, Maimonides is as well known for his philosophy as he is for his code book. Joseph Caro is, of course, living in Sfad, which is the center of Jewish mysticism, but the code book is just a code book based. It's not a mystic work. He's not decoding anything. He's just basically, what's the word, organizing the whole Talmud in an easy to read form. And that's what I'm sorry, Larry?
Could you go back a second to the
Sure.
time when Maimonides did he write this in Spain or in Egypt? And
he's in Egypt. Yeah, his whole life was in Egypt.
And the relations with Muslims and Jews was good?
Very good. During this period, Jews living in the Muslim world is where this is where you wanted to live. So Jews living in Mesopotamia, although Spain had a short period where things were very difficult for Jews, that's when his family left. But generally, North Africa, Spain, Portugal, and the Mesopotamia area, Iraq, Iran today, which is Persia then, were the best places for Jews to live. Yeah.
I understand, as a matter of fact, that wasn't Maimonides the physician to Saladin?
He was. He was the physician, also treated kings in Europe. So
right. He was actually invited to become the court physician in England and turned that down.
He was probably the greatest known doctor of his age, even outside the Jewish community as well. But he did go to Europe at times to treat people there. He had a very long and fruitful life. We don't know if this guy slept. That's the only question. That's probably the only thing he wasn't good at, because what he does do is beyond compare in many ways in terms of the amount of writing two great works like this and being a doctor and writing so many other things. It was just and he was the leader of the Jewish community, and he traveled so he was really incredibly gifted. So any questions, by the way, so far?
Yeah, just one other question now. You know, the Muslim world is divided between the Shiites and the Sunnis. He lived in Egypt, which is a Sunni country.
Right.
I imagine that the Shiites were the much more conservative part of the Muslims. Were they as enlightened then? Or because they looked to the Ayatollahs, they looked to the authoritarian leadership, more than the Sunnis who look for, let's say, merit, or look for some relationship, the princes, some relationship to Muhammad.
Yes, this was definitely an educated age for all of them. In fact, the area today known as Iran, Persia, was for a long time the most educated place in the world, both in the Jewish community and the outside community in the 9th and 10th centuries. So there were still issues between Sunni and Shiite, but the radicalism we see today probably was not as, a lot of radicalism is because of the other forces besides them. But yeah, they were, they still did not get along, but I don't think they were as what you would call the visions of today are the same as the yesteryear, certainly not when it comes to secular education.
It's interesting also, the Pope was just in Iraq over the weekend, and he went to the city of Ur. And met there by one of the Shiite, even though Iraq has got a Sunni Shiite, he was met there, and it was the first time that a Pope was allowed into that country to see, the city of Abraham's birthplace.
Yeah, So it's pretty impressive. But Floss, you have a question, and then Rena.
On?
You're on.
Okay. My question is a little premature to go back to what you said he wrote as far as where he uses the word perplexed. I'm just very surprised he used that word.
Well, that's the translated word. We're going to get to that in a second as to why he used that word. And it's very specific as to why. So we'll get to that in a second. Let me finish with Mission of Torah, and then we'll go there.
Jump in. I was thinking, boy,
Oh, yeah.
that's an interesting word.
It is, and it's deliberate. It's very deliberate on his part. Rena.
I just have a question. It may be nothing to do with this. What was the Hammurabi Code?
The Hammurabi Code is an ancient code from the 19th, early 18th centuries by a Babylonian ruler named Hammurabi. So there are other codes beforehand, and some of the things in this code, this was a code of laws, how to behave, don't murder, that kind of stuff. It were laws of behavior that we still have copies of to this day. It's one of the earliest such sets of laws we have.
Was he Sephardic, or he wasn't even?
Hammurabi actually predates Judaism. Some believe Abraham was born during the period where he reigned, but obviously we can't prove that. So think of Hammurabi 1800 BCE and
Wow.
Moses 1300 BCE. So although there is a belief that a few of the 10 commandments are based upon the code, we can't prove that. But we do have copies of the code. They're probably older ones, but that is the most famous, I think, because we have so much of it. All right, good questions. So lastly, when he wrote the Mishnah Torah, he wrote it in Arabic, using Hebrew letters, kind of like how, so instead of the Aramaic of the Talmud, he wrote it in Judeo-Arabic. Why did he write it in Judeo-Arabic? Because he was writing it for masses. He's writing it for the regular people, and not everybody could read Aramaic. And so that's why he did it. So that was another reason why people were not happy with it. Of course, it's going to be translated later. Lastly, he doesn't only use the Talmud, he uses other works and gives law. And since he's not citing sources, he uses the Gaons of Babylonia in the 700-800s. He uses the Tosefta, which is basically stuff that was really important that did make it into the Talmud. And sometimes he puts that ahead of the Talmud and Mishnah. Tosefta is all the stuff during the time of the Mishnah that didn't make it in the Talmud, but it's still important. Sometimes he uses those views ahead of overviews in the Talmud. So it's like taking the view of me over someone like Larry, so something unprecedented. So for these reasons, the Mishnah Torah is still venerated, but he was not as venerated as we are today. You're welcome, Larry, for that. I just complimented you. So that's the Mishnah Torah, and it's an incredible work. Later on, as we said, it's going to be more and more welcome. It was so heretical to some people that it was burned. Jews would burn this book sometimes during his lifetime and immediately afterwards. And there's a very famous rabbi who burnt the book, and then he saw at another place somebody burning a Talmud, a non-Jew burning a Talmud, and then he felt really bad, and he wrote a whole treatise on how bad he felt for burning books. So today he is venerated across the board. At the time of the writing, he was a little less so, and a very controversial person. So he becomes even more controversial, and I cannot say this enough. If he had written this next book first, he would probably would not be as important as today. He was smart enough to write to show how brilliant he was as a Talmudist before he went into this very strange area of philosophy. Now, philosophy, of course, is not new to Judaism. He brings some ideas that had been used before, but he does something very difficult for people who are Jewish in Europe to understand. He uses Greek philosophy and brings it into Judaism. You have to remember, Greek philosophy, everything Greek was still the best ever. And if you're living in Europe, you have no access to this stuff. You're not familiar with it. Most people now, by the 12th century, it's making a comeback, but by and large, the Greek philosophy and math and all the Greek thought is very prevalent in the Muslim world. They use it as a taking off point, but not in the Ashkenazic world. So when he starts using, and he is what we call an Aristotelian, or however I pronounce that word, that is who he bases a lot of it on Aristotle. Very similar to what Jews did in the early days, in the years 0 to 100, 200, when Greek thought was so prominent. Greek everything plus Jewish ethics kind of made the modern world. So he is using Aristotle as a starting point, which is really a problem. He writes it in Arabic, which is a problem, obviously. So he writes this. It's translated in, 10 or 15 years later, and after he dies, he's still considered a heretic. Now, why is he a heretic? It's because philosophy is controversial. And he does a lot of things, although some are not unique. As I said, Philo, 1,100 years earlier, 1,200 years earlier, did some of the same stuff. But he's much more recognizable as a human being than as. So what did he do that was so controversial? First of all, he talks about the anthropomorphism of God, especially how we cannot speak about God using human terms. That anytime you see a human term referred to God, it is not meant to be taken literally. God does not walk. God does not talk. God does not move. God is God. And so anytime we do it, and this idea has become basic Jewish thought today. I mean, understood across the board. So, but he really centers his beginning that it's heresy, that God is what we call corporeal in any way.
Oh, good girl. Yeah, I'm on my rabbi's class.
So right away he's starting like that God is not corporeal. If you say anything that refers to him in this matter, you are being a heretic. You can't refer to God most famously in anything but negative terms. If you call God mighty, mighty does not mean the same thing for God as it does for somebody else. It's a completely different meaning. Anytime you reference God with any word, it is different than if it reference a human being. So basically, step one to being Jewish is God is not incorporeal. God is not something we can define. What do I mean by God's in the negative? And we've talked about this before. All we can say about it, God is what God isn't. We can't say anything about what God is. We can talk about what God does or what God did. God created the world. I am not defining God, only what God has done. God is the spirit of the universe. That is an attempt to define God, which is impossible. So that's the difference. And he makes it very clear that there has to be this idea, and it has to be dogma, which is something that Jews do not like, that type of phraseology, dogma. We like to have our options open, but he says this is what you got to believe. So as you can see, if you don't believe this right away, he's already calling you a heretic. And there had been rabbis throughout the ages, obviously, because we have so many opinions, who did not. So right away, he is insulting anybody who has a different view than him. So obviously, he's going to be very controversial. Luckily for him, even a lot of people did not have access to this book before he died because it was in one language. They may not have had access to it. They would have heard of it and heard different things about it, but they would not have had access to it in their own language unless they were probably living in a Muslim world. So God cannot be described in positive terms. Does not mean we don't say God is good. It's not saying God is bad. We just say God is not. That's the only way we can describe God. God is not human. God is not corporeal. God is not anything. So right away, this is the very beginning of the book. So get rid of the anthropomorphisms. God is not an entity that can be described and does not have any form. You have to know this. Number 3 is something that was viewed very, again, he's a heretic and stuff, but some areas he's not. One area in which he was right on the guidelines of Judaism was his belief that you cannot study the Guide of the Perplexed until you have mastered the Mission of Torah. You don't study philosophy until you master law. You don't study calculus until you've mastered algebra. You don't study fractions until you've mastered addition. You got to get the basics, and the most important thing is to know the Jewish law. Then that's why we see for mysticism later on, they say you don't study till you're 40. It doesn't have as much to do about the specific number 40. It's that you need to first master Jewish law, have some sense into you through life, and then you can start studying mysticism. And this is not heretical at all. This is pretty much what is agreed upon now. He takes the views from Aristotle, and he puts them into Judaism almost verbatim, and then he adds on Jewish belief. And the most obvious thing is intelligence. He is very much a believer in science, intelligence. So basically, he agrees with Aristotle on almost anything, except he brings it into the Jewish world. When God made human beings in God's image, it was the intelligence God gave us. That is when prophets speak, and this is another issue, he doesn't believe everything in the Bible is meant to be taken literally. This is not that controversial because a lot of rabbis did. That is not a new concept, but the way he said it, basically saying only Moses actually you can take literally. Only what God says to Moses can be taken literally. Any other prophet you can't, because God sends out this information. And how does the prophet know what the information is? The prophet uses the prophet's intellect to take what God's saying and put it into their own words to make sense for the people. So basically, these prophets are intelligent people who have the ability to understand God because of their ability to disseminate the information coming from God. So anything you see talking to them is not meant to be taken literally until they actually say it themselves. It's all allegorical. So if you see an angel talking to a prophet or God sending a dream, that is an allegory. That is not meant to be taken literally, because that's just only Moses heard God in the same way that we would talk to another person. So the world, so intelligence, so basically the world or our universe is surrounded by heavenly spheres of intelligence. And so all of heaven basically is intellect. And that's how we are going to learn, is through our minds. And he is very, very centered on this. Why? Because he's coming from an intellectual country. He's coming from a place where science is preeminent along with religion. And lastly, he does a lot of his work based on Ezekiel. And Ezekiel is a very strange character that up to this point in Jewish history, you really kind of didn't deal with too much because he's so out there. And Maimonides dove head first and used a whole book based on Ezekiel's visions, the raising of the bones, the seeing God in the chariot. And he goes right in and dives right in, which was kind of considered not what, I guess it was just not what you were supposed to do. So this was he also dealt with the issues of evil in ways that not everybody agreed with. So this is him being to many people a heretic. To other people, he's the greatest sage of all time, even during his time period. And as time goes on, he becomes less and less of a heretic because some of his views become more and more prominent. Certainly, mysticism really takes a lot of it from him. So to this day, he's become one of the most important people in the history of Judaism. But again, during his time period, he had some issues. So any thoughts before we continue? Or questions?
Rabbi, yeah, I have one.
Sure,
So,
Larry.
a couple of years ago, we read, and Michael spoke about it before, The Many Faces of God, the book that you introduced us to. And I kind of thought that was a very modern concept, that God was this ephemeral image, that he instilled in us certain thoughts. And I kind of love that kind of thought. But you're saying that Maimonides, 800 years before or something, had similar kind of ideas that were so progressive, but then they kind of fell out of favor. Is that what happened?
They didn't fall out of favor, but they weren't followed by everybody. Mysticism brought it to the Ashkenazic world. The Baal Shem Tov and all that kind of brought it into their world. Maimonides didn't create all of it either. Aristotle did, and Philo used it, who was Jewish. So this stuff had been around, but he's the one who kind of made it, put his stamp on it and said, Jewish philosophy works with Greek philosophy to a point. We just have to take it to the next level. Aristotle was a heathen. He was an idol worshiper. He could only go so far, but he wasn't wrong. He just kind of like saying, somebody's saying, Stuart says, I don't believe in the Big Bang. And Sheila says, I believe in the Big Bang. And that's it. And then Larry says, well, I believe in the Big Bang, but I think God made that ball at the very beginning. So Stuart doesn't believe. Sheila can take it to a certain point of logic, and Larry takes it to the next level of philosophy. So, but no, a lot of modern philosophy is based upon Maimonides. Probably more he's probably number one in terms of Jewish philosophy. Now, of course, a lot of people don't believe him and has gone different directions, kind of like Freud. Freud is kind of the godfather of this type of thought, and Maimonides is too, because he really was very prominent and because he lived in an educated world, so he could bring these two things together where people in other places didn't have that same option. We'll go to Flossie and then Michael and then Stuart.
How old was he when he wrote when these two books were written?
He was, I think he was in his 60s and 70s while he was writing them.
Wow.
He was not a young man. I don't know exactly for sure what year was he born. Yeah, this was years, towards not the end of his life, because he did live a long time, but actually I think he finished the Guide of the Perplexed a few years before he died. Let's see here. Let me just see. I don't remember exact dates of when he lived. Let's see here. 1 second.
How long did it take him to write them? Was it especially
the Mission of Torah took him 10 years. So he was born in 1138. So he wrote it in 80, so he's in his 50s, 40s and 50s when he was writing it. The Guide to Perplexed finished 10 years later, so he was in his 60s.
And the other question, which I find amazing, we're talking before a printing press. We're talking everything
Right.
handwritten. So he probably had scribes or people, he's composing and creating it and they're writing it. How many copies could there have been around for people to see and be part of if everything is written by hand?
And that's a good, now there were people whose job was to do this. So you're right. So people who were skilled, like a so fair today, but that was a much more prominent position before. So one, it's limited. I mean, you had limited access to all of these things, and it also took a while, probably got through word of mouth before it got through. Number two, he wrote it in a language that not everybody understood. So you have to pass it around to people who speak Arabic, and then somebody has to go and translate it because he didn't translate it. It was translated, I think, after he died. And so it takes a long time for these things to get spread out. Whereas once the printing press came, it is the game changer, maybe the most significant moment that in the last millennium. Michael, and then Stuart.
Just as a curiosity, I mean, when you're in rabbinical school and you're studying philosophers, how much emphasis on Rambam as opposed to, say, the Baal Shem Tov or other, philosophers, later on that maybe had more influence on Reform Judaism? In
our world, Maimonides is still number one. I mean, in the probably more so in the liberal Jewish world, although he's major in the Orthodox Jewish world as well, because he's a scientist, so he's a pragmatist. He is somebody who says, he is someone who, if he had lived in the 18th, 19th century, he would have beaten Darwin to the punch. That's who he was. But he would have added a philosophical. He would have said, God created human beings to be able to evolve over time. He would have made it all godly intervention as opposed to simply, this is the way it happens. So this is why he is such a prominent person across the board, but also why in some places he is considered a little bit out there. But if you go in, I mean, he's number one philosophically on probably all places that are not Hasidic. Stuart.
Hasidic rabbis speak with such reverence, though, about him as well.
Oh, yeah.
Even though I guess, you're saying he's a man in both camps, in science and in religion and faith, but the Hasidic rabbis I've heard in the past, he's a very endearing figure.
Oh,
so
yeah.
Certainly he is able to.
Oh, yeah, he is.
All sects of Judaism.
What I meant to say,
yeah. Go back to the 13 principles.
Right.
I mean, those are, that's the core of traditional Orthodoxy.
Well, I was not saying they don't like him. I was saying more like the Baal Shem Tov probably is higher on the level, and Maimonides would be afterwards. Like for us, probably Maimonides is more important to liberal Judaism than Baal Shem Tov, but to that world, Baal Shem Tov led an entire movement that changed. Plus, the Baal Shem Tov was, Ashkenazic, so that's why he's going to be higher. Stuart, you had a question.
Yeah, I have more of a comment. It's always seemed to me, the guide to the perplexed, but by its very name, is perplexing. Let's say, indeed. One looks at it, one is explaining explanation, but in reading any of what is written in it, it becomes very confusing. And ultimately, I came to the conclusion that what was really the essence of where he was going was reconciling Jewish thought, particularly, to use it as a metaphor, the construction or the start of the earth, and looking at the Jewish view and looking at the Aristotelian view, which are very, very different. The Aristotelian or Greek view really talks about the earth as being, or the world as being at the center of some sort of a universe, and it's sort of like an egg with a yolk with white around it, and that's another part of it, and then a shell at the outside, and maybe some more levels, but this is all spinning. And the essence of God, I think, in this Greek view, is that God is a prime mover, and God's job was really to push it, to start this motion because something had to start it, but essentially has no role in the world or in the universe after that function of starting things moving. Whereas Judaism is talking about and thinking about the idea that one has to have a continuity. This whole idea of intelligence is that God is still here and everything is there, so that God is part of the creation, not independent of the creation. And my conclusion, and I don't know that it's right, came to be essentially that the whole basis of the Guide to Perplex was really to reconcile this Aristotelian view of God with the Judaic view of God, because we're all seeing the same world and the same effects. How could it have happened? Which is correct? Or how did it, if they're both correct, how does it reconcile that God is a prime mover, but also an intelligence which is continuing to exist and interact in some way with mankind?
And that's pretty much it. I mean, basically, Maimonides believes in the science that Aristotle has given, the idea that we're the center of the universe and that there's things surrounding us. He would call it heavenly bodies, we might call it dimensions. But he's bringing God into it a little bit more. Aristotle is still not into the God vision that Maimonides has. Maimonides has a very different vision of God and a very different vision of intelligence and a very different view as to how the first domino. And when it comes to is God interacting, that is another debate that he is not as specific about. As there's still some people in Judaism who believe, one domino, God made it all and then let it play out. Maimonides is not one of those people, but that is still, so that, you basically said it better than I do. So everybody listen to what Stuart just said. Thank goodness we recorded it. Larry.
You had mentioned earlier that, and I haven't read the Guide to Perplex. I read parts of it, but you said it's kind of like the quinoa example that you gave. Can I eat quinoa at Passover?
No, that would be the Mishnah Torah.
Oh, that's the Mishnah Torah. Okay, so what questions can I find easily, let's say, in the Guide to Perplex? Is there an easy answer to some of the questions, like, for example, or are they pretty much based on the law? How do I bury, my relative, or are they those kinds of things that he takes right out of the Torah?
No, that is the Mishnah Torah. The Mishnah Torah is, how do I bury my relative? What is quinoa? When the reason it's called Guide to the Perplexed, it's basically we're reading the Torah or the Bible, and some really strange, impossible thing happens. The donkey is talking. The God is on this chariot, and you can see God or the crown of God. Things like this, that if you take literally, you are going to be perplexed. However, if you look at it as a metaphor or as a simile or as a, what's the other one? I've just forgot the word. Oh my goodness. Not simile, metaphor. I just forgot the word. Oh my goodness. If you look at it, allegory. Thank you, allegory. If you look at it as an allegory, then it makes sense. The creation of the world, for instance. Is it meant to be taken literally? If it's meant to be taken literally, the sun, as we've talked about, is created on the day 4. We know the things don't work without the sun. But if it's an allegory about the process in which God creates the universe, then I understand it. So the perplexed are those people who take these things literally, and we will become, so it's a guide for those of us who are confused by all of these things that don't seem reasonable and are not based on science.
Okay, so the Mishnah Torah is really the code book that you look things up to get
Right.
these quick answers to questions about
Right.
practice.
In many ways, they are the opposite ends of the spectrum. That's why it's so amazing that one person did both, because he's talking about the reality of actual law, and he's talking about the viewpoint of philosophy. And there are two different books written by the same guy, one right after the other.
Are his code books, for example, if I looked up a particular answer, let's say to the question of quinoa, I've just used that as a silly example.
Yeah, that's one not in there, but yeah.
Okay, but if anyone, would he be consistent with Joseph Caro?
In a lot of things, yes. They would be consistent on a lot of things. Again, Joseph Caro figured out why everybody didn't like, why Mission of Torah not become the main code book on the basis, and he did it. So two things he did most importantly. One is he did the citations. He did not put people's views over people who are more important in many ways. Like he didn't take the Tosefta and the Gaonim necessarily, or if he did, he made sure to tell why. And then two, I got an Ashkenazic rabbi to work on it as well.
But they both basically stem from the 613 commandments.
Yeah. I mean, they're not written in the same way. I mean, they're written very differently, and the Shulchan Aruch has a different organization structure. It's in 4 parts, but they have a lot of the same laws. Are pretty much, yeah. Stuart.
I wonder if in some way the Guide to the Perplexed isn't written as a justification for Mishnah Torah. Mishnah Torah tells you all of the things you should do and you shouldn't do in a large sense. But it leaves the question is, why should I do all of that? And essentially Aristotelian thought doesn't answer that, because in a large sense in the Greek thought, God is no longer here. God did his job and he went away. So what's the point of having this set of rules? Let's have a set of rules for how we interact and how we satisfy each other. Whereas I think Mishnah Torah is aimed not at how we satisfy each other, but that we're doing these things, we're living the way we are to satisfy some other intelligence that is still here.
Yeah, again, that's one way of looking at it. A lot of it also has to do with ethical ideas. Ethics doesn't play as big a part in Aristotle as it does in Maimonides. The specific viewpoints of God interacting with us and caring about us, that is a whole nother level. So, I mean, on basic level, Maimonides says yes to Aristotle on the science and the philosophy up to a point, and then he takes it a point farther. But yeah, I mean, basically, it's pretty much not word for word, but a lot of what Maimonides says is basically directly taken from Aristotle. He admits it, he says it. So you got to remember, and I'm living in Egypt. I'm in an educated world. I'm a super educated doctor. I just wrote this Mission of Torah. I see science. They invented calculus. They've got the number 0. They got all this cool stuff. And then I write something based upon Aristotle, which in Egypt is okay, because Aristotle is a very major player in Muslim thought at this time. Because, however, in Western Europe, who was Aristotle? He is this ancient heathen from the Greeks who took over Israel, and they were idol worshippers. Why would we be even using Aristotle? They don't have access to what Aristotle actually said. They probably heard that he's a heathen philosopher. So right away, they're thinking, what is Maimonides doing here? However, because he's already written the Mission of Torah, he gets a little bit of a pass, because he's written this great work that has been, even if people didn't agree with it, even if people didn't like the fact that he didn't cite things, even if they thought he shouldn't have put Tosefta views up ahead of the Mishnah, they all realize how brilliant it is. So, Larry.
Yeah, I remember many years ago when we were in Israel, that they took us to what I think was the grave site of, or at least it was a mark or a tombstone for the grave of Maimonides. And there were women that came in from the desert, from I'm not sure where they were from the Sinai or someplace, and they were sprinkling rose water over it, and they were praying to him. It was one of the most moving sights I think I could remember. Then we were in Spain, and we also saw, I thought, what was the grave site. Is he buried in Israel, or is he in Spain, or don't we know? Or are these just monuments? I didn't even think at the time.
Well, that's a good question, and nobody knows for sure. However, they believe he was buried in around Tiberias, that area. So that's where you would have been when this happened. So he died in Egypt, that we know, and then it's told that he was brought to Israel, and that's where he was buried.
Yeah, it was quite a connection that I saw with these women sprinkling rose water and praying.
It's not unlikely. I mean, Egypt is really close to Israel. It's along the trading route, so it's very possible he said, "I'd like to be buried in Israel." Plus, they were controlled by the same people. Rena.
I have a question. Today's society, Greek Orthodox, Judaism, all that. Well, let's say in Greece, do any people are they non-religious and just believe in Aristotle's philosophy?
Oh yeah, definitely, definitely. I think again, it works really well, Aristotle, if you're not religious in many respects. And it works really well in connection. And I'm not as, I mean, sounds like Stuart is much more knowledgeable in Aristotle, but it works from a scientific perspective, but you can add on the religious perspective as well. And so that is why Maimonides was so appreciative of what he had done, because he saw that you could take it to the next level. So Aristotle across the board is venerated. There's nobody who doesn't venerate him as a brilliant, I mean, the most brilliant maybe person of that millennium. I didn't know him personally, but I know he was a good guy. I think he was a good dancer.
But it wasn't mixed into Judaism, Catholicism. Are there any parts?
Oh yeah, it's all taken. I mean, he is taken for everybody. The most famous Christian would be Thomas Aquinas. He's the one who brought Aristotle. I mean, it had already been there, but he brought Aristotle into that world. You got to remember, the Christian world of Europe is the Dark Ages. They don't have Greek thought for a very long time. But once they get it, they just take off running. And Thomas Aquinas is kind of like the Maimonides for the Christians. The Christians would say Maimonides is kind of like the Thomas Aquinas for Jews, bringing this idea of science and religion in a mix. Because remember, in the Dark Ages, science was not something that was considered legitimate by a lot of people. I mean, if you're practicing science, you could be killed. You could be considered a heretic. And so you had to tread very lightly. Look what happened to Galileo. So Noel, and you're on mute, Noel. No, before you talk, you're on mute, just to let you know. No worries. No rush. Go to the left bottom corner where it says unmute.
Just
click on that.
Aquinas.
I need to say something to Flossie before I have to leave.
Oh my goodness, hi, buddy.
What would you like to say? And then we'll get to Michael.
No, I wanted to say it to Flossie. After I pull up all of the dead stuff in my backyard, I'm creating Flossie's garden. And it's going to have not only flowers, but Judaica.
Oh my God.
And just things from my collection so I can think of you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. We'll have to come visit.
We'd love it. Texas is a great. Texas, Houston's a night, obviously not now, but once the pandemic's over.
Yeah, okay. I just
That's
want to
here.
tell you.
Well, that's very kind. I
I
thank
don't
you.
know if I wanted to tell Flossie that.
Thank
We
you.
appreciate it.
Very
All right,
kind.
we'll conclude with Michael then.
Well, I mean, just an observation. I mean, Aquinas, is probably alive, 50, 75 years after Maimonides.
Yeah, I think it's about 200. I think it's even
So
older.
you could you know, he's in the 1200s, I think, and and so you could say that he, built on.
He did. He did build.
know,
He did build on Maimonides. You got to remember, by the time he's alive, science is starting to creep in, and Greek thought is now already starting to go around. So there's certain things you can start saying, and he is very good at walking the line that Maimonides does in bringing science into religion. And if it's when you bring science that crosses religion, that's where the issue is, or crosses certain immutable facts like the earth is the center of the world, which was to them a big deal. But, so you couldn't, as long as you didn't cross these lines, you could add onto Aristotle, and he did the same thing. He was very familiar with Maimonides. Yeah.
and even at that time, Christianity did not want to recognize the number 0.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, my favorite part of this, if you ever read the Shogun, was it Shogun? I think that was the novel that where the Europeans get shipwrecked on Japan, and they see all these disgusting people. They're so they take baths every day, and they can't. And so once the main character has been there for a couple of years, he goes back and he happens to go into a bar where some of these guys, because they haven't been able to leave, but they've kind of been ostracized. And he goes in there and he can't even stay in the bar because the smell is so disgusting being next to these people. He can't believe that he was ever like that. So it takes a while for this to go on, but Thomas Aquinas is able to walk that line. Flossie. Oh, you're mute, Flossie, sorry.
I'll be on mute.
Oh,
but
wait,
now,
I'm sorry.
now go.
Am I okay,
Go.
honey?
Yes,
Okay.
go.
Did you answer the question I asked about perplexed?
Yes, I'll do it again. Basically, the reason he called it perplexed is if you're reading the Bible and you're reading things that don't make sense, like the sun is made on the 4th day, like the donkey is talking, that you're perplexed as to why would God do this? And the answer is it's an allegory. So he's saying, for those of you who are perplexed reading the Bible, this is who it's for. All those things are not meant to be taken literally. So only Moses, God talking to Moses, that's literal. If he had said God talking to Moses was an allegory, this probably would have never been read again. That would be too far. He probably did think that. You can't go too far, or else nobody's going to read you. So he said the prophets that weren't Moses, they were allegories. God was sending them information in allegorical form that they had to disseminate and then tell to the people in what it really meant. So, Rena.
So in other words, all these prophets interpreted it in their own way. In other words,
Exactly.
you can't be sure what they're saying is the truth. Really, it's their own judgment.
And that is very close to being heretical, as you can imagine. But he basically said God gave them wisdom to disseminate, to understand, and to teach. And so he's like not quite exactly where you are, but he's really close. So you've gone over the edge a little bit farther, but just a little bit. So, we're right on that border of what you can say. You can only take things so far, and until you're closed down by society, and then you're never heard from again. And so he did not want to cross that border. Well, always awesome, guys. Thank you very much for studying. Next week, now question is, I forgot. Do we want to meet next week, or can we skip next week? Because next week is St. Patrick's Day on the 17th. So do we mind if
Well, next week is my birthday, and I'm getting my 2nd shot. I'm so excited.
Happy
My
birthday.
vaccine. I'm getting my vaccine on my birthday.
Are we live?
Excellent. Well, if we want, we can still do it.
Yeah.
Do we still want to do it? Okay, so we'll do it next week at 10:30. All right. All right. So next week we're going to study Passover. I think specifically, let me go back to what I think that's the Seder. I think we're doing the Seder next week or the next 2 weeks. I have just the history of the Seder next week. So we'll see how far we get to the history of the Seder. If we finish it or do enough, we'll just do something on Passover the week after. And don't forget, if you want Passover meals from the synagogue, make sure to call in order.
Rabbi, could you also maybe next week make a comment? I saw there was a new ruling from the Israel Supreme Court on marriages.
Yes, I'll be happy. Why don't we talk about that? I'm happy to talk about that, and also about the ICC, what's going on there, which is always is really. But I apologize, I have to go. Flossie, one more, and then I apologize. But
Okay, when you talk about Passover, can you bring in Passover traditions around the world?
oh yeah, well, we do that secondly. So
Okay.
we'll definitely do some of that. We'll do like 2 weeks. We can even do 3 because, of course, the next week is actually during Passover.
Okay.
And probably far enough in that I'll be frustrated with eating so much matzah and my stomach will be retaliating.
Oh, don't go there.
And
Is that gonna be on
Israel-
YouTube?
Yeah, we're gonna
On
put the
YouTube?
Passover Seder is gonna be on Zoom, for sure YouTube. I'm working out today if it's gonna be on Zoom. We need to figure out how we're gonna do the Zoom and YouTube because I'm getting filmed. So I won't know exactly the technology. We're going over that later today and he'll tell me how we're
Okay.
gonna do it. But it's definitely
Thank you.
on YouTube. It'll be live on YouTube.
As they say in
Thank you.
Israel, the Seder.
Stay safe, everyone. I'll see you.
Thank you.
And don't forget, we do have a podcast today at 3. All right, so I'll see you guys soon.
Okay, thank you.